Welcome to the 5th Executive Leadership Council Business Brief. I'm Mike Hyter, President and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council. August the 3rd, 2021 is Black Women's Equal Pay Day. It's the approximate day a Black woman must work into the new year to make a white, non-Hispanic man-made at the end of the previous year salary. The nonprofit organization Equal Pay Today shines light on this day to bring attention to the stark inequality in compensation for Black women in the United States workforce. Based on the American Community Service Census data, the 2021 wage gap for Black women compared to non-Hispanic white men is 63 cents. Other statistics report the gap at under 70 cents to every dollar paid to white men. Here to discuss inequality in the wages of Black women is my esteemed colleague, Erika Irish Brown, a former Wall Street executive and the new Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and Global Head of Talent at Citi. Erika is also an ELC member, I'm happy to say. And I want to acknowledge that last September, Citi released the findings of a study titled Closing the Racial Inequality Gaps, the Economic Cost of Black Inequality in the US. It is an exhaustive study that looks at Black inequality in wages, education, housing, and investment, and the impact of these inequities on the US economy. Welcome, Erika. It's so good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me. And I want to thank ELC for doing this series. I'm really proud to be a member, and I think this is an important dialogue for us to have today.
Awesome. And on behalf of our ELC board chair, Lloyd W. Brown II, who is the Corporate Community Reinvestment Act officer at Citi, and our ELC members, we want to thank you as well for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us in discussing this very pressing and lingering issue as well. So let's get started. What made you choose diversity, equity, and inclusion and make that transition from your work as an investment banker? And what was the pay equity conversation like at that time? I just thought it would be important to start with that question.
Sure. Well, Michael, when I started on the street, there were no roles like the one I have today. So the few women and people of color were the advocates for change from the line. And I wanted to be an agent for change. I wanted to advance the conversation in a direction that wasn't explored before with the credibility of someone who had thrived in and knew the business. I wanted to be in the room when the conversations were being had on performance, promotions, and most importantly, compensation. This wasn't territory that had been explored before. And I knew that by being in the DEI role and being a Black woman myself, I was hoping to affect real change and help shift the conversation. So, at the time, the conversation was non-existent, but there's been much progress made within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space over the last decade or so. I would argue that most recently, the topic of pay equity has come to light, and most specifically, the wage gap for Black women. So excited to have this conversation and definitely trying to move the needle when it comes to the wage gap for women, for people of color, and for Black women.
Awesome. Citi has studied the promotion and wage gap for Black workers. Have you, Erika, observed progress toward an increase in wages and compensation for Black women in general?
Have I observed progress? Well, unfortunately, I think little has changed from an actual wage perspective. I think the issue and the data has become more visible and top of mind for many, including government, corporate, and D&I leaders like myself. Citi's Closing the Racial Inequity Gaps report highlighted some really important truths. It identified the key racial gaps for Black Americans, which are wages, housing, education, and investment. And the study found that if the gaps were closed today, up to $5 trillion could be added to the US GDP over the next 5 years. For context on the wage gaps specifically, the study shows that Black workers are underrepresented in management, business, and professional occupations that, as you can imagine, pay the highest salaries, and that the number of Black managers is roughly 10% compared to almost 20% among white workers. Additionally, Black workers represent less than 10% of STEM careers and roles in finance that pay top wages. And we're overrepresented in sales and services, transport, and are more likely to be situated in jobs that are more susceptible to automation. And that's going to be a real issue over time. The last thing I'll share is that the report also found that Black people are disproportionately represented in low wage jobs and high contact essential services like healthcare, childcare, food prep. And this was painfully clear when COVID hit. And only 20% of Black workers were able to work from home during the pandemic. So the systemic issues and social inequities, that brought us here. And when we look at all of that together, we see why Black women make 63 cents for every dollar white men do. And what's even more concerning is that almost 80% of Black mothers are the breadwinners for their families. So when you think about Black households, they're relying on these wages, these 63 cents on every dollar to make ends meet and get ahead. So not enough progress.
Wow. Well, how can corporations make greater progress towards eliminating the wage gap for Black women?
Leadership needs to be accountable. We need to increase transparency. Those are the keys to making progress. I mean, there's definitely been progress in the conversation institutions are having on this topic. Companies are being asked to disclose this information more and more. Investors are leaning in. The increased focus on pay equity is going to prompt real change over time. And there are certainly actions that companies can take or have already taken to advance progress. A lot of companies now do in-depth analyses to understand the data on how their company stacks up when it comes to pay equity for like roles. And when they found discrepancies, adjustments have been made. 4 years ago, Citi was the first major US financial institution to publicly release the results of a pay equity review, comparing compensation of women to men and US minorities to US non-minorities. Since then, we've continued to be transparent about pay equity, also disclosing our unadjusted, or what we call the raw pay gap for both women and US minorities. And these disclosures hold us accountable for the progress we want to make so that we can be a diverse and inclusive employer of choice. I think it also sends an important signal that we're continuously working to get this right. The other issue that comes through in these analyses is the importance of representation at the senior levels of the firm. We recognize that the root of the results was in the lower senior representation of diverse talent across the firm, which is why continuing to reduce our raw pay gap required that we set and, of course, make progress on aspirational representation goals. Mm-hmm. So at Citi, we've publicly shared aspirational goals to increase the representation from the assistant vice president to managing director levels to at least 40% for women globally and 8% for Black employees in the US by the end of this year. And we're committed to getting that done. That which gets measured gets done. Mm-hmm. Companies can also find opportunities both internally and through external partnerships to make progress towards goals and to increase diversity at senior levels and therefore chip away at the wage gap. Companies need to do outreach so that young people and young women in the Black community can see banking, technology, and high-paying careers as career paths available to them. Companies should have hiring practices that broadens the pool of talent so that they're sourcing from organizations and institutions like HBCUs. And then in the hiring process, companies should require both diverse slates of candidates as well as diverse interview panels. Employee networks are really important groups to support diverse employees and drive an inclusive work culture at the firm. And at Citi, we acknowledge intersectionality between the work of our Black heritage and the Citi Women Networks, and we created Black Women at Citi, a network to better support our Black women and focus on initiatives that increase representation for Black women at senior leadership levels. Earlier this year, we hosted a forum for Black women at Citi and had almost 200 colleagues join this inaugural event.
Wow, that's great. Black women, of course, face obstacles because of their gender and race, as you know. Is there anything else, in your opinion, that Black women can do to proactively seek equity and pay in their workplaces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's accountability on both sides. So, we as Black women, we need to raise our hands for that next level opportunity. We need to use our voices and offer our unique perspectives and leverage our unique presence as a competitive advantage. So I would encourage Black women to find opportunities to network with senior management, participate in diversity efforts and the networks, use the employee networks. Over the years, the networks have been a great vehicle to provide not only safe space to raise issues like pay equity, but also exposure to senior management. It's important right now that, we continue to speak out. We're in a moment of progressive change and more companies are willing to have the conversation. Most importantly, as Black women, we need to know our worth and not be afraid to ask for it. From my experience, I've seen so many women, and particularly Black women, that either won't apply for the job because they don't have maybe every qualification on the list, or they're uncomfortable negotiating compensation, or get nervous that if they push too hard, they might lose out on the job offer. But in doing that, they're selling themselves short. We bring unique capabilities and experiences to the table that no one else can, and that is our secret weapon. So, we should be doing our own research on roles and, really applying for top roles and setting our own compensation expectations up front, and the more that we take that ownership, I can see us moving the needle on that wage gap. And the last thing I'll say is that I would encourage Black women to recognize and understand the importance of having allies. In order to make progress on pay equity, we need support from our non-Black colleagues. There's definitely a need to drive these initiatives and drive change at the senior most level, the board level, the management level, and we need that allyship and advocacy and sponsorship at our companies. So, to secure allies, sponsors, advocates, that may require making ourselves vulnerable or even asking for help, which isn't, very easy for us to do, especially given the lack of support and help over the years. But, that's what it's going to take to get that information, to get that support, and ultimately be agents of change.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just have, since I have you here, I just have one more question that is, I really wanted to make sure I asked you. How has the conversation around Black diversity shifted since the murder of George Floyd?
Yeah, there's certainly more awareness and more of a conversation about race, racism, discrimination, and inequities in the workplace. So I think in the past, when we talked about diversity and inclusion and perhaps disproportionate impacts or inequities, it was more in the framing of unconscious bias versus systemic racism. So I think the conversation has changed. I think there is now a greater understanding of the lived experiences of Black people and a much more honest dialogue. And I think companies have made a lot of public commitments to racial equity that they're going to have to deliver on.
Yeah.
So I think that's the good news, that these companies are going to have to be held accountable based on public declarations that have been made. And, I'm really happy to be here at Citi. And our Action for Racial Equity initiative is, an over $1 billion commitment to help close the racial wealth gap. So, whether or not it's investment in communities, whether or not it's investment in Black women-owned businesses, and, it just runs the gamut. Supplier diversity, it's a holistic approach to closing that racial wealth gap. And I'm proud to now be a part of that. And I think other companies have made really aggressive commitments, and we all need to hold each other accountable and share best practice and work as an industry to, rising tides float all boats. Yeah. And that's what we need to be doing to really move the needle on the topic of pay equity for all, for women, for African Americans and the Black community, and certainly for Black women.
Yeah.
For all.
Erika, this has been such a valuable and enlightening conversation. And I'm just so glad that you had the time for your voice based on your experience and your wealth of knowledge to be shared with all of us. It was just so great to see you and to hear from you about this topic. And congratulations again on your new leadership role at Citi and in the C-suite. I mean, we're just so excited about your continued success as well. And thank you for your ongoing commitment to Black talent and to the ELC specifically, because you've continually demonstrated in so many of your leadership roles across your career. We're grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. The pleasure is all mine. And I'm really excited to continue our partnership from my seat here at Citi.
Thank you. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. And stay tuned for details about our next ELC CEO LinkedIn chat. They'll be coming up in September. Take care.